Hi, this is Chris from Orange Coast College's Art Department covering the Layers palette in Adobe Photoshop for digital painters and illustrators. In particular, this is for artists that are new to Photoshop to give them a quick orientation to the Layers palette. Now, the Layers palette for me is the most important palette to have out, and if I'm having only one palette on my main display, it's going to be the Layers palette. So let me reach down here and pull it out of its grouping, and we'll just close that group and have it front and center for us. Now typically I wouldn't have it right in the middle of the screen. I would have it off to the right side, taking up the whole right side of my main display. Let's go ahead and look at what's important and what's not important to get you up and running fast. As with most things in Photoshop, there are a lot of ways to do the same thing. So let's quickly cover an overview of the palette, how it works, and then we'll get into some details. So we have here the Layers palette, and on most palettes in Photoshop, we've got a little pop-out menu. We'll go over this in detail in a minute. We've also got a lot of buttons and fields down at the bottom and the top. And you'll notice that Layers have their own menu in the main menu for Photoshop. And so if you compare these, this menu and this menu are 3/4 redundant. So there's a lot of crossover between the two. So you can do many things with keystrokes, many things with either of those menus, or you can use the buttons on the layer palette. Let's get started by creating some new layers through several different means. Let's start first with this icon down here on the Layers palette, create a new layer. And you'll notice that in my layer stack I have a new layer in that gray and white checkerboard tells me that the pixels are transparent on that layer. I'm going to go ahead and use my elliptical marquee tool to make a circle, and then I'm going to fill that circle with my foreground color and make it red, and then deselect, and now I've got a red circle on a layer. You'll see it's still named layer 1, so I'm going to call it red circle by double clicking on the name, typing, and hitting enter. So that's one way to create a layer and name it. Let's look at another way. Using the layer palette, I can come up here and select new layer. And now this time when I do it, it's going to give me a little box where I can call it something. How about blue square? And there's some options you'll see in here. We can create a clipping mask, which is very important for digital painters. We can run a color on that layer, and we can affect the opacity in the blending modes. For now, I'm just going to hit OK. And I'm going to switch over to my rectangular marquee tool, and I'll make a rectangular selection. Let's select a new color and fill with foreground, deselect. So now I've got a blue square in a layer, I've got a red circle in a layer, and let's do one more. Let's do a new layer from the palette flyout menu. Let's call this yellow triangle. Again, same way, I'm just going to hit OK and not make any of those other changes. Select my polygon lasso tool and make a triangle. Select yellow color, fill it. So now I've got 3 layers, plus my background of white. You can see that they're just the shape on transparent pixels. And this type of layer, yes, there are multiple types, is just pixels. There's nothing fancy about it. It's not a vector shape. It's not an adjustment layer. It's just pixels in a transparent field. So let's go ahead and grab the Move tool, and you can see I can float these. And you can see the layering corresponds from top to bottom with my layer stack. If I want to put my yellow triangle into the background, I can drag that layer down and you can see he's now in the background. If I want to put my red circle on top, I can drag that up there and now my red circle is on top. So you can adjust the order of your layer palette by just clicking and dragging. Really easy. Now that we see how to make a few basic pixel layers, let's go ahead and look at the different kinds of adjustments, buttons, different things we can do with that layers palette. Right up here, this top layer is, if we've got, let's say, 60 different layers, which is not uncommon for a painter, you may want to filter which ones you want to look at. And so there are actually different kinds of layers we can do, and we can filter for many different criteria. I don't do that too often, but here are a set of buttons that help you filter. You can turn your filtering on and off using that toggle. On the next line down, we have blending modes. These are really important to digital painters and illustrators. You're going to want to spend some extra time getting to know these. Next to that is opacity. Let's alter the opacity of the red circle here. Let's adjust that, and you can kind of see it's now 45% opaque, 55% transparent, and I can adjust that with this slider. And I can, this is not permanently changing it, this is just changing opacity, and I can edit that to my heart's content. Below that is fill, which works much the same way as changing opacity, except when you change opacity on a layer that has a lot of attributes, all those attributes change opacity with it. If you change the fill on a layer, the attributes do not change with it. Now, there are some times that you're going to want to lock certain attributes for your layer, and that's what this next line is down next to the fill. You're going to lock transparency a lot. That happens very frequently. Less frequently, locking the pixels. Position, yes, you'll lock a lot. Artboard's kind of new to Photoshop. I don't use it for painting and illustration, but you may. And then this last one is just lock them all. So for instance, let's lock the transparency of this red circle. Take a brush and let's paint with some pink. Now, I can't paint in the pixels on this layer that are transparent because I locked them. So I can only paint on the area that there was already pixels. So let's unlock, well, first let's undo and then unlock that area. Now, if I want to paint on this layer, I can paint as much as I want. This is not a new layer over the red. I'm actually painting out the red pixels, switching them for pink, and I'm adding pink pixels. So that's why you might use that lock transparency mode. Let's undo that and move on. Down at the bottom row, now these are really handy. You can delete a layer. You can also do that just by hitting the delete key, which you do more often. We already took a look at this, create a new layer. You can also do that with Command-Shift-N, which is typically how I do it. I actually don't use any of those three methods. I go straight to the keyboard. We can create a group. This is super important, especially when you get lots of layers. So for instance, I can hit this and I've got a group. This is essentially a folder of layers, so it helps you organize. So I can take this, shift and drop them into that group. Then I can close that up. They're still there, but sometimes you have so many layers that you need some organization to them. Let's go ahead and undo that. Adjustment layers. These are very important. You're going to use a lot of them, and it's going to be helpful to go through and get to know them all. That's a subject for another video. As well as this. layer effects or layer styles. You're going to want to get to know these ones. You won't use them as much, but every once in a while, one of these effects will come in handy. So the styles are styles you can apply to a layer. The adjustments are new layer styles. So when I click one, let's do hue saturation. It's a new layer, and it has properties unto itself. So get to know those. Between the two of those, layer masks. This is very important. As a painter and illustrator, you want to get to know layer masks. Again, a subject for another video, but very critical. And then last over here, we can link layers. So let's say we want to link the red and yellow. I'm going to command click them so they're both highlighted. Now I can link. And if I wanted to go with the move tool and move, let's say, just the red, because it's linked to the yellow, they're both going to move together. I use this sometimes, not too often. So let's go ahead and unlink that guy. And then lastly, let's get a quick rundown of the Flyout menu. So new layer, another way to do that, but honestly I use the keyboard shortcut you see there, Command-Shift-N. Don't worry about CSS or SVG. CSS is for web, SVG is for vector. Duplicate layer, yes, you'll use that from time to time. There are other shortcuts. Delete layer, again, just like the button down below. I use the delete key for that guy. Delete hidden layers. This is nice. So when I turn off the visibility of a layer, let's say I turn off the visibility of the circle and the square. You may end up having 50 layers and 20 of them you've turned off the visibility and you don't care about anymore, but it sure would be tedious to delete them all. You can come in here and delete those hidden layers in one shot. But I'll do it as an example and then we'll undo it. Let's go ahead and show the visibility again of those layers. Moving on down, quick export as PNG, better used for web designers as well as export as. New group, we just saw the button for that. Here's a menu command for it. New group from selected layers, that's good. Collapse all groups, so if you have a bunch of open folders, in one shot you can close them all up to be neat and organized. Artboards are a newer Photoshop function, taking it from Illustrator. I don't use it in my workflow. You may end up using it in yours. I like to have separate files, but it could be because I've been using Photoshop from before this is available. You can lock layers, much like we did in the button on the palette. Convert to smart object. I don't usually convert layers to smart objects, but if you want to create a separate instance of just what's on that layer so that you can edit it or just make sure that it doesn't get degraded, you can convert it to a smart object and it'll keep an instance in the library. Let's move on down to important stuff. So more ways of getting to your blending options, like the drop-down menu. Create a clipping mask. This is super important. Again, a subject for another video, but you're going to want to get to know clipping masks. Link layers, much like we saw in the buttons. Merging. All right, so if we want to merge a couple layers, I can do merge down, which we can do here, and it joined the blue square with the red circle into one layer. You'll do that a lot, so you want to get to know that. In fact, you'll probably just end up using the keyboard shortcut after a while. Then there's merge all your visible layers, in which you're taking multiple layers and bringing them together. And then flatten image is the ultimate of that, just every layer merged into one, and what is not visible is merged in as not visible, and you end up with just one. Let's go ahead and show that. So merge them all, that's just one thing. And undo to get us back to where we were. Animation objects, don't worry about options, don't worry about this for painting and illustrating. Let's bump down here, close this panel and close the tab group. That's just window options. Let's look at the panel options real quick. So this is just a way to further customize the layers palette. Right now we've got this second preview size, but you may want to see bigger or even really big. So that makes the thumbnails really large. You can really tell what's going on. So that's one way of doing that. Let's look at some other options. You can make your thumbnails have only what's in the layer. So here you don't see the whole canvas, you just see circle, square, triangle. And then some other adjustments which are kind of fine-tuning. I wouldn't worry about those for now. I'm going to go ahead and move on back to the small thumbnail size. The more layers you have, the smaller the thumbnail you're probably going to want to work with. So you can imagine if you had 50 or 60 layers, you may not want to have that really large thumbnail. Let's look at one last way to get some information about the layer you're on. You can just double click your layer and you're going to get this layer style box, which gives you access to your blending modes, your opacity, your fill opacity, advanced blending, and then blend if the gray value of this layer is only so much. So this is really fine-tuning blending. So if you want to get in there and make your, let's say, your lighter values transparent and your darker values opaque, you can make adjustments here. In here you can also access your layer styles. So we can get in and investigate and make edits to any layer styles that we've got going on. So this gives you a quick overview of the layers palette. Again, I find it the most important palette. It does a lot of what you need as a painter. My personal setup, I keep a layers palette on my main display and I move all the other palettes to a second display. And so that kind of gives you an idea of the priority that I give it. So I encourage you to move on and explore those areas of high importance that I noticed and keep on making awesome art.